The Scottish actor who defined James Bond harbored a decades-long resentment against the producer who made him famous. A bitter feud that shaped Hollywood history and poisoned a billion-dollar franchise. The phone rang in Sean Connery's London flat on a gray autumn morning in 1967. The actor, now world-famous as James Bond, picked up to hear the familiar voice of Albert "Cubby" Broccoli, the powerful producer who had transformed Connery from an unknown into a global icon. "We need to talk about the money," Broccoli said flatly. Connery's jaw tightened. For 5 years and five blockbuster films, he had made Broccoli and the Bond franchise hundreds of millions, while his own salary had barely budged. The actor took a deep breath and uttered 7 words that would fracture one of cinema's most profitable partnerships. "I'm done being your dancing monkey, Cubby." He slammed down the receiver. The Bond producer and his star wouldn't speak directly for months, and the wounds from this confrontation would never truly heal. But to understand how the most iconic actor-producer relationship in action cinema crumbled into decades of mutual contempt, we need to rewind. Thomas Sean Connery entered the world far from Hollywood glamour on August 25, 1930, in the working-class Fountain Bridge district of Edinburgh, Scotland. The son of a factory worker and a cleaning woman, young Tommy Connery left school at 13 to deliver milk. By 16, he joined the Royal Navy, only to be discharged 3 years later due to a duodenal ulcer. Back in civilian life, Connery bounced between jobs: truck driver, lifeguard, coffin polisher, and even nude model for art students. His imposing 6'2" frame and natural athleticism led him to bodybuilding competitions and eventually a spot representing Scotland in the 1953 Mr. Universe contest in London. It was there that fate intervened. A fellow contestant mentioned auditions for a production of South Pacific. Despite zero acting experience, Connery landed a chorus role, discovering his true calling at age 23. For the next 7 years, Connery clawed his way up through bit parts in British film and television, refining his craft but rarely breaking through. Directors noted his physical presence but struggled with his thick Scottish accent, an ironic criticism for a man who would later be twice named the sexiest man alive, precisely because of that distinctive voice. Meanwhile, in America, producers Albert R. "Cubby" Broccoli and Harry Saltzman had acquired the film rights to Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. Born in 1909 to an Italian immigrant family in New York, Broccoli had worked his way up from the bottom of Hollywood. Starting as a gopher, he eventually became a successful producer with a reputation for commercial instincts and iron-fisted control. In 1961, Broccoli and Saltzman formed Eon Productions specifically to bring 007 to the big screen. Their first mission? Finding the perfect Bond. Established stars like Cary Grant and David Niven were approached but proved too expensive or uninterested in multi-picture commitments. Then Broccoli's wife Dana suggested they look at that Scottish guy from Disney's Darby O'Gill in The Little People. When Connery walked into the audition, Broccoli was initially underwhelmed by the rough-around-the-edges actor in casual clothes. But as Connery left the room, Broccoli and Saltzman watched through the window as he crossed the street with a predatory grace that screamed Bond. "He moved like a panther," Broccoli would later recall. Against the studio's wishes, they cast the unknown 32-year-old, paying him just $16,000 for Dr. No, released in 1962. The film transformed Connery overnight from struggling actor to international sex symbol. Critics and audiences alike were captivated by his blend of lethal charm and physical menace, a Bond both sophisticated and dangerous. Broccoli had found his golden goose, and Connery had found both stardom and the golden handcuffs that would eventually become unbearable. But here's what the glamorous premieres and glowing press didn't show. From almost the beginning, a dangerous fault line was forming between the Scottish actor and his producer. Two strong-willed men, one from the slums of Edinburgh, the other a self-made Hollywood power broker, were locked in an escalating battle over money, respect, and creative control. What began as mutual appreciation would spiral into one of Hollywood's most notorious feuds, a relationship so toxic that decades later, Connery would still refuse to be in the same room as the man who made him famous. So who was the real villain in this Hollywood drama? Was it the controlling producer who allegedly underpaid and exploited his star? Or was it the difficult actor who grew too big for his Savile Row suits? Buckle up. The true story of Sean Connery and Albert Broccoli's bitter relationship reveals something far more complex and far more human than the stylized conflicts their Bond films portrayed on screen. When Connery signed his initial Bond contract in 1961, he was a virtual unknown desperate for his big break. Broccoli and Saltzman, sensing their leverage, offered terms that would become the source of decades of resentment. The deal paid Connery just $16,000 for Dr. No, a pittance even by early 1960s standards for a leading man. But the real poison pill was in the fine print, a multi-picture deal with only modest salary increases regardless of how successful the films became. I was earning less than a grip, Connery later claimed, with considerable exaggeration but genuine bitterness. The truth was somewhere in between. He wasn't destitute, but he was dramatically underpaid relative to the franchise's explosive success. When Dr. No hit theaters in October 1962, it cost just over $1 million to make and earned more than $59 million worldwide, an astronomical return on investment. Yet when Connery arrived to film From Russia with Love in 1963, his salary had increased to only about $54,000. By Goldfinger, 1964, the third and most iconic entry, he earned approximately $85,000. Meanwhile, the Bond juggernaut was transforming Eon Productions into a Hollywood powerhouse and making Broccoli enormously wealthy. The producer, known for his luxurious lifestyle, purchased a mansion in Beverly Hills and traveled by private jet while his star simmered. For Connery, this wasn't simply about money, though the money mattered. It was about respect. A working-class Scotsman who had once delivered milk was now the face of a global phenomenon. Yet he felt treated like a replaceable asset. Bond gave me a personality before I had one, Connery once remarked. Now I've got one, and they don't want me to use it. The comment revealed his growing awareness of a painful irony. The role that made him a star was also trapping him in a golden cage controlled by Broccoli. By the time Thunderball wrapped in 1965, the groundwork for their explosive falling out had been firmly laid. Connery began to publicly hint at his frustration. When asked about playing Bond again, he responded with a terse, "Never say never again." Broccoli, for his part, was growing increasingly irritated by what he perceived as his star's ingratitude. In his view, he had plucked Connery from obscurity and created a superstar. The producer expected loyalty, not demands. The stage was set for an even more dramatic confrontation. The production of You Only Live Twice in Japan marked a breaking point in the already strained relationship between Connery and Broccoli. What should have been a triumphant globe-trotting shoot became an ordeal that Connery would later describe as a living hell. From the moment Connery's plane touched down in Tokyo in July 1966, the problems began. Japanese Bond fans were fervent beyond anything the actor had experienced. Thousands swarmed his hotel, followed his car, and disrupted filming. One particularly disturbing incident involved a female fan who reportedly followed Connery into a bathroom. "I couldn't even take a shower without looking over my shoulder," Connery later recalled. The production itself was plagued with difficulties. The script underwent constant revisions, typhoon season disrupted outdoor shoots, and cultural and language barriers created daily complications. Through it all, Connery felt Broccoli provided inadequate protection from the press and fans, prioritizing publicity over his star's well-being. In a particularly revealing moment, Connery exploded when he discovered photographers hiding in the bushes outside his ryokan. The actor reportedly stormed into Broccoli's office, demanding better security. According to production assistants, Broccoli dismissed his concerns, telling Connery that fan attention came with the territory. For Connery, this cavalier attitude toward his privacy and safety represented everything wrong with Broccoli's approach. The producer saw Bond, and by extension Connery, as a commodity to be marketed, not a human being with legitimate grievances. The tension reached its apex when a persistent Japanese reporter trailed Connery for 3 days straight. When the actor finally confronted the journalist, the ensuing altercation made international headlines, with some outlets painting Connery as temperamental and ungrateful. Broccoli, rather than defending his star, reportedly told associates that Connery needed to grow up and accept his position. This perceived betrayal cut deep. By the time filming wrapped in a grueling 6 months later, Connery had made his decision. He informed his agent to renegotiate his deal for any future Bond films dramatically, a move he knew would provoke a showdown with the controlling producer. The seeds of their most explosive confrontation had been planted. That fateful phone call in autumn 1967, the one where Connery declared he was done being Cubby's dancing monkey, wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of months of increasingly hostile negotiations over Connery's compensation for a sixth Bond film. After completing You Only Live Twice, Connery had watched the film gross over $111 million worldwide, while he had earned roughly $750,000, a substantial sum, but a tiny fraction of the profits. Meanwhile, Broccoli's wealth had grown exponentially. The producer now owned multiple homes, a yacht, and lived the very lifestyle Bond portrayed on screen. When discussions began for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Connery and his representatives demanded a package worth $1.5 million, plus a percentage of the gross. Unprecedented terms for that era. More significantly, they wanted creative approval over scripts, directors, and co-stars. Broccoli was furious. In his view, Bond was bigger than any actor, and he wasn't about to cede control of his franchise to its increasingly difficult star. According to production executive Tom Carlyle, Broccoli told colleagues, "Sean has forgotten who made who. I'll find another Bond before I'll be held hostage." The negotiations collapsed entirely when Broccoli and United Artists refused to meet Connery's terms. In December 1967, Eon Productions officially announced that Connery would not return and began searching for a replacement, eventually casting model-turned-actor George Lazenby. For Connery, the money was secondary to what it represented, recognition of his contribution to the franchise's success. As he later told Playboy magazine, "I'd been screwed too many times by the producers to have any interest in making them richer." Broccoli, meanwhile, viewed Connery's demands as a betrayal of the opportunity he'd been given. In private, he reportedly referred to the actor as that ungrateful bastard from Edinburgh, and vowed to prove Bond could succeed without him. Both men had made their stands on principle, but their principles were irreconcilably opposed. Connery wanted autonomy and fair compensation. Broccoli demanded control and loyalty. Neither would bend. This financial battle would leave wounds that never fully healed and set the stage for an even more personal confrontation years later. The spectacular failure of On Her Majesty's Secret Service to match previous Bond box office returns, despite positive critical reception, created an unexpected opportunity. By 1970, barely 3 years after their bitter falling out, Broccoli found himself in the uncomfortable position of needing Connery back. United Artists executives concerned about the franchise's future applied enormous pressure on Broccoli to re-secure his original star. The studio offered Connery an unprecedented package, $1.25 million plus 12.5% of the gross profits. More significantly, they pledged to finance 2 non-Bond films of Connery's choosing, the creative freedom he had long desired. Connery agreed to return for Diamonds Are Forever, but with one condition that spoke volumes about his relationship with Broccoli. He would not sign unless the producer personally apologized for their past conflicts. According to multiple accounts, Broccoli swallowed his considerable pride and made the apology, though those present described it as perfunctory at best. The producer reportedly told Connery, "The past is the past. Let's make money together again." Hardly the heartfelt reconciliation the actor had hoped for. The atmosphere on the Diamonds Are Forever set was notoriously tense. Connery and Broccoli maintained minimal contact, communicating primarily through intermediaries. Director Guy Hamilton later recalled, "You could feel the chill when they were in the same room. It was like watching 2 scorpions circling each other." Adding insult to injury, Broccoli allegedly reneged on elements of their agreement. The 2 films United Artists had promised to finance for Connery faced mysterious budget concerns and scheduling issues that many attributed to Broccoli's behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Only one, The Offense, was ultimately made. Connery finished Diamonds Are Forever and immediately announced he was done with Bond forever. This time he meant it, at least as far as any film Broccoli controlled. In a cutting parting shot, Connery donated his entire salary to the Scottish International Education Trust, a charity he founded to help underprivileged Scottish youth get educated. The message was clear. The money had never been his primary motivation. Proving Broccoli wrong was worth far more. For his part, Broccoli would later tell associates that getting Connery back had been necessary medicine for the franchise, but that the actor had become impossible to work with. The producer moved on with Roger Moore as his new 007, beginning a successful seven-film run, but the bad blood between the original Bond and his producer was far from over. The most dramatic chapter in the Connery-Broccoli feud erupted in 1983 with two competing Bond films racing toward theaters. In one corner stood Broccoli's official Eon production Octopussy, starring Roger Moore. In the other, Never Say Never Again, a remake of Thunderball starring none other than a 52-year-old Sean Connery, returning to the role that made him famous. This unprecedented situation stemmed from a legal loophole. Producer Kevin McClory had collaborated with Ian Fleming on the original Thunderball story and retained rights to that specific material. After years of legal battles, McClory was finally able to mount his own competing Bond production and convince Connery to return, at least partly as a direct challenge to Broccoli. When Connery signed on to Never Say Never Again, he knew exactly what he was doing. The title itself was a self-aware joke, referencing his famous vow never to play Bond again. More pointedly, the salary he negotiated, reportedly $5 million plus a percentage of profits, was a public statement about his worth, deliberately dwarfing what Broccoli had paid him years earlier. Broccoli was livid. According to production executives, when he learned of Connery's involvement, he banned any mention of the rival film at Eon Productions and began a behind-the-scenes campaign to undermine its distribution and marketing. The producer reportedly used his considerable industry influence to pressure theater chains to give preferential placement to Octopussy. He also allegedly convinced several longtime Bond creative team members to refuse work on Never Say Never Again, forcing that production to assemble a largely new crew unfamiliar with 007's cinematic language. For Connery, these tactics confirmed everything he had always believed about Broccoli's character. In interviews promoting Never Say Never Again, while never mentioning Broccoli by name, he made thinly veiled references to certain producers who believe they own actors and Hollywood types who can't stand competition. The battle became intensely personal. When a journalist asked Broccoli about Connery's return, he dismissively responded, "We've moved on to better things." Connery countered in his own interview, "Some people can't accept that their formula isn't the only valid approach." In the end, both films performed well, with Octopussy slightly outgrossing Never Say Never Again. But the true victory for Connery wasn't financial. It was proving he could play Bond without Broccoli's permission and still draw audiences. The rival Bond film saga cemented their status as permanent adversaries. They wouldn't speak directly for the next decade. Perhaps the most revealing moment in the Connery-Broccoli relationship came in 1988, when Connery won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his role in The Untouchables. This career-defining triumph became yet another battleground in their decades-long feud. As Connery approached the podium at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion on April 11, 1988, he faced a decision. Throughout his acceptance speech, he thanked director Brian De Palma, co-star Kevin Costner, and even his accountant, but conspicuously absent was any acknowledgement of the role and the man who had launched his career. Not once did Connery mention James Bond or Albert Broccoli. The omission was glaring to industry insiders who knew that without Bond, Connery might never have achieved the stardom that eventually led to this Oscar. For Broccoli, watching from home, the snub was reportedly devastating. "Cubby actually expected a thank you," his daughter Barbara Broccoli later revealed. He thought that, with the perspective of time, Sean would finally acknowledge what Bond had done for his career. Instead, Connery used his moment of ultimate industry validation to deliver perhaps his most powerful statement yet: complete silence about the franchise that made him a star. The aftermath further poisoned their relationship. At a post-Oscar industry event, Broccoli reportedly told associates loud enough for nearby reporters to hear, "Some people forget the shoulders they stood on to reach the top." When this comment made its way back to Connery, the actor responded with characteristic bluntness, "I didn't stand on shoulders. I survived a leash." A leash. For Hollywood insiders, this exchange revealed the fundamental nature of their conflict. Broccoli genuinely believed he had created Connery's success and deserved gratitude. Connery, conversely, felt he had overcome Broccoli's exploitation to succeed despite him, not because of him. The Oscar snub represented a turning point. No longer were they simply former colleagues with a difficult history. Connery had now publicly rejected any association with the producer at the most significant moment of his career. Reconciliation, if ever possible, now seemed entirely out of reach. As both men entered their later years, their conflict evolved into a battle over how the early Bond era would be remembered by history. This final phase of their feud centered on memoirs, documentaries, and the official narrative of the franchise's creation. In 1998, Broccoli worked with author Donald Zeck on When the Snow Melts, the autobiography of Cubby Broccoli, published shortly before the producer's death. The book portrayed Connery as talented but difficult, suggesting that the actor's career success was predominantly due to Broccoli's vision in casting him against studio wishes. Particularly galling to Connery was Broccoli's characterization of their compensation disputes. The producer described Connery as suddenly greedy after success, dismissing legitimate concerns about fair payment as ingratitude. Connery, who had always been guarded about his private life, refused multiple lucrative offers to write his own memoir that might have countered Broccoli's version of events. Instead, he selectively gave interviews where he carefully recalibrated the narrative. In a revealing 1999 BBC interview, without mentioning Broccoli by name, Connery noted, "There are always people in the film industry who believe discovering talent entitles them to own it. I spent many years breaking those chains." The conflict extended beyond words to ceremonial recognition. When Connery was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in July 2000, becoming Sir Sean Connery, many expected some acknowledgement of his most famous role. Instead, Connery emphasized his Scottish identity and charity work, again conspicuously avoiding any mention of Bond or its producer. Perhaps most tellingly, Connery declined numerous invitations to participate in Bond anniversary celebrations or retrospective documentaries produced by the Broccoli family after Cubby's death in 1996. He remained the only major Bond actor absent from officially sanctioned franchise histories. In a 2002 interview, when asked directly why he avoided Bond retrospectives, Connery gave a response laden with subtext. "Some versions of history aren't worth legitimizing with a contribution." Even as both men aged, with Broccoli's death in 1996 and Connery's withdrawal from public life in the early 2000s, neither ever fully acknowledged the other's importance to their success. Their mutual animosity outlasted their active careers, shaping how each approached his legacy. This was no longer about contracts or creative differences. It was about who would control the story of James Bond's early years and the men who created the phenomenon. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Connery-Broccoli feud is how it transcended the original participants, continuing through a second generation. After Cubby Broccoli's death in 1996, his daughter Barbara Broccoli and stepson Michael G. Wilson took over the Bond franchise, inheriting not just the business, but also its complicated relationship with its original star. Throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, Barbara Broccoli made several attempts to mend fences with Connery. According to franchise insiders, she reached out multiple times to invite him to participate in Bond anniversary events or special recognitions, believing the passage of time might have softened his stance. These overtures were consistently rebuffed. For Connery, the issue wasn't personal with Barbara. By all accounts, he respected her professional accomplishments. Rather, participating in officially sanctioned Bond celebrations would have meant implicitly accepting Cubby's version of their shared history. The tension became public during the production of 2012's Skyfall, when rumors circulated that Connery might make a cameo appearance. Director Sam Mendes reportedly wanted Connery for the role of the gamekeeper at Bond's ancestral home, a part that ultimately went to Albert Finney. Barbara Broccoli neither confirmed nor denied approaching Connery, but sources close to the actor revealed he declined without hesitation. One anonymous associate told The Hollywood Reporter, "Sean would rather crawl over broken glass than appear in anything with the Broccoli name attached." The inherited conflict reached its peculiar conclusion in October 2020 with Connery's death at age 90. In a press statement, Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson offered gracious praise. He revolutionized the world with his gritty and witty portrayal of the sexy and charismatic secret agent. He is undoubtedly largely responsible for the success of the film series, and we shall be forever grateful to him. This posthumous olive branch, acknowledging Connery's central role in the franchise's success, was precisely the recognition the actor had sought from Cubby decades earlier. It came too late for any real reconciliation. Even in death, Connery had the last word. His autobiography, which he had worked on sporadically for years but never published, reportedly contains a chapter titled The Bond Business that presents his unfiltered perspective on Broccoli. According to those who've seen portions, it's far from flattering. The instructions in Connery's will allegedly stipulate that this manuscript cannot be published until certain other individuals have passed away, a final chess move in a conflict that spanned more than half a century. Some feuds end with forgiveness. This one ends with carefully timed revelations from beyond the grave. Yet for all the bitterness between these two titans of cinema, there were moments of grudging respect and even near reconciliation that complicate the narrative of pure animosity. In a rare unguarded moment during a 1987 interview, Connery acknowledged, "Whatever our differences, and there were many, Cubby had an eye for what would work on screen. I won't say I owe my career to him because I worked damn hard for it, but he saw something in me others didn't." Broccoli, for his part, wrote in his autobiography that despite everything, Sean brought something invaluable to Bond, a dangerous masculinity that audiences responded to instinctively. He wasn't manufactured in a studio system. He was real. There were also fleeting opportunities for reconciliation. At the 1982 Royal Film performance of For Your Eyes Only, Connery and Broccoli unexpectedly found themselves seated in the same row. According to attendees, they exchanged brief cordial nods, the closest they came to bearing the hatchet in their later years. Perhaps most poignantly, when Connery's wife Micheline suffered a serious illness in the early 1990s, Broccoli sent a brief handwritten note wishing her recovery. Connery acknowledged the gesture with a similarly brief thank you card. Two proud men momentarily setting aside their grievances in recognition of more important things. These glimpses of humanity remind us that even the most bitter Hollywood feuds exist between complex individuals capable of moments that transcend their conflicts. Why did Sean Connery maintain such profound resentment toward Albert Broccoli for decades, rarely speaking his name and avoiding Bond celebrations even when doing so cost him financially? The answer lies in something deeper than contract disputes or creative differences. For Connery, born into working-class Edinburgh with nothing, his identity was forged through struggle and self-determination. The son of a truck driver and a cleaning lady, he had fought for everything he achieved. Broccoli, in Connery's view, attempted to take credit for and control over not just his career, but his very identity. When the producer spoke of creating James Bond, and by extension, the Connery persona, it struck at the actor's core sense of self-authorship. There's a vast difference between being grateful for an opportunity and being owned because of it, Connery once remarked. "I refuse to be a well-paid servant." This wasn't simply about money or screen time. It was about dignity. Connery believed Broccoli never saw him as a full creative partner, but rather as a replaceable element in a formula the producer controlled. This perception fostered a resentment that time never diminished. For his part, Broccoli genuinely could not understand Connery's ingratitude. From his perspective, he had taken an enormous risk on an unknown actor, created an international sensation, and made them both wealthy. The producer expected loyalty and was bewildered when Connery instead demanded autonomy. Their conflict reveals a fundamental tension in Hollywood, the line between discovering talent and claiming ownership of it. Where one man saw reasonable expectations of loyalty, the other saw intolerable constraints on his independence. Connery kept this feud private for strategic reasons as well. Throughout his post-Bond career, he worked to establish himself as a serious actor beyond 007. Publicly revisiting his Bond grievances would have kept him tethered to the very role he fought to transcend. Additionally, the Scottish actor understood the value of mystique. By refusing to engage in public mudslinging, he maintained his dignified image while allowing rumors of the feud to enhance his reputation as a man of principle who couldn't be bought or controlled. This carefully managed silence served him well, allowing him to be remembered not as a complainer, but as an actor of integrity who stood his ground against one of Hollywood's most powerful figures. The phone rang in Sean Connery's London flat that gray autumn morning in 1967, setting in motion a half-century of animosity that would define both men's legacies far beyond what either imagined possible. "I'm done being your dancing monkey, Cubby," Connery had declared before slamming down the receiver. And in that moment of defiance from a proud Scotsman who had once delivered milk in Edinburgh's slums, Hollywood history pivoted. The actor who gave life to James Bond reclaimed ownership of himself, whatever the cost. If you asked who Sean Connery truly hated more than anyone, the answer was the man who made him famous. Because making someone famous isn't the same as respecting them. And for Sean Connery, respect was always worth more than gold.